The ultimate professional who was the catalyst for increasing levels of professionalism in the game, or an overrated relic whose significance is overstated? Just how good was Steve Davis? Steve Davis was the game's first consistent heavy scorer. We're not talking Stephen Hendry or Ronnie O'Sullivan levels of scoring, but Davis's scoring was vastly superior to any player around in the 1980s. When we look at his centuries per season graph, we can see that Steve was a consistent century scorer from the mid-80s until the mid-90s, with his personal best of 31 centuries during the 1992-93 season, which as of the 24th of October 2025 is also the personal best of world champion Zhao Xintong. It's also worth mentioning that the tables, balls and cloths that were around when Steve was in his prime were definitely inferior to today's equipment, but I don't believe that this was a huge issue, not as huge as some might say. Steve was significantly weaker at breakbuilding in the 2000s and beyond, which would not be the case you'd think if the newer tables and equipment carried as much weight as they did. Zoning in on Steve's frames per 50 plus break, Steve's 4.05 frames per 50 plus break is not elite by today's standards, but comparing it with Alex Higgins, Ray Reardon, Dennis Taylor and Cliff Thorburn, and you can clearly see how much better Steve was than his peers at the 1980s. The eye test helps Steve, especially in his prime. You can tell his technique is very good and his ball striking is efficient, and that's the key word, efficient. Davis may not be considered an elite break builder in the same breath as Hendry and O'Sullivan, but he was a very efficient break builder who pushed the boundary higher in the 1980s. Thanks to you legends for voting in my recent poll where you chose Steve Davis as the player to analyse in this video. I am on a push to get 2,000 subscribers as soon as I can, so if you're not already subscribed and you like my content, subscribe, it's free. Also, like the video if you're enjoying this content and keep a lookout for future polls. I'm going to make a claim straight away and say that Steve Davis was the world's first consistently elite long potter. Sure, players before him such as Alex Higgins and John Spencer were eye-catchingly good when their long pots went in, but they didn't go in as often as you may think. Steve was the first player to come along and knock in a very high percentage of his long pots, which is another reason why his break building was so much better than his peers, because he could pot a high percentage of long balls to begin a big break. His long potting wasn't spectacular, and that's why, due to availability bias, we might not remember or consider Steve to be a superb long potter, but he truly was. He not only redefined long potting, he made safety play better because players had to make sure not to leave Steve opportunities to pot long balls. And speaking of safety play, we come on to Steve's big strength. Steve's tactical brain was one of the reasons he was world number 1 for 7 consecutive seasons. The likes of Ray Reardon and Cliff Thorburn were very good safety players, as was Terry Griffiths, but a lot of their safety play was about disrupting the opponent and containing the situation, not giving an inch and containing the situation. Steve was different. His safety play was about trying to control the situation and force his opponent into a mistake. Safety play was Steve's right hook, whereas safety play was Ray Reardon's jab, keeping the opponent at arm's length. Steve paved the way for a new breed of safety players to come along, such as John Higgins and Mark Selby, who have taken the skill to arguably new heights. But without Steve, there would be a missing link between the old style containing safety play and the new controlling style. You don't win 6 world titles, 6 UK titles, and 3 Masters titles with a poor temperament. In his pomp, Steve was the ultimate poker face. Win or lose, and Steve Davis was cool as a cucumber, calmness personified. Steve's big strength was creating an aura of invincibility, which the great champions such as Stephen Hendry and Ronnie O'Sullivan have also adopted when they're at their best. That's what separates the very good from the very best, that aura, and Steve had it in abundance. Steve was a professional from 1978 until 2016, which is a very long time. However, I'd argue his prime as a player was from the early 80s to the early to mid 90s, so I'll be comparing him with 6 players from this time. Davis 41, Jimmy White 21, drawn 6. Davis 25, Alex Higgins 5, drawn 1. Davis 29, Dennis Taylor 9. Davis 18, Cliff Thorburn 7. Davis 34, Terry Griffiths 14, drawn 5, and Davis 20, Stephen Hendry 45, drawn 2. So, as we can see, against his 80s peers, Steve Davis was far, far superior. But when we match him up with Stephen Hendry, the player who took Steve's mantle as the best player in the world, we can see that Steve's record kind of drops off a cliff. Steve also has negative ratios against other 90s players, such as Ken Doherty, Ronnie O'Sullivan and John Higgins, but fares well against Jimmy White, John Parrott and Peter Ebdon. Therefore, I come to the conclusion that Steve's dominance in the 80s was due to his head and shoulders above quality, but that as the emerging 90s players came along and adapted their games to a more aggressive and ruthless style, Steve struggled. Overall, Steve Davis is a legend. He was an efficient break builder, a world-class long potter, and was an animal on the table that dominated the 1980s. He raised the bar for professionalism, break building, long potting and safety play, and is still the blueprint for professionalism today. His weaknesses were that he was not adaptable enough to evolve his game into the 1990s and beyond, which is where he falls short of the likes of Ronnie O'Sullivan and John Higgins, who have been able to stay relevant for over 3 decades. Nonetheless, Steve is one of the most important snooker players of all time. So let's get into the rating. Break building, 7 out of 10. World class in the 80s, just outside of the elite by today's standards. Long potting, 8.5 out of 10, truly world class in his pomp. Safety play, 9 out of 10, his true strength. Temperament, 8 out of 10, world class in the 80s, dropped a little as the standard grew higher. Head-to-heads, 8 out of 10, invincible against the 80s crowd, drops off in the 90s and beyond, for a total of 40.5 out of 50. And that puts Steve in the elite category, slightly below the master category. And before you all take to the comments to say, how can Steve Davis not be in the top category? Remember, I'm judging all of these players by today's standards. So in my opinion, Steve Davis would be a very good top 8 player with the ability to be top 4 on his day. Steve in his prime would still be elite and would win a lot of tournaments, but would lack the scoring power of the likes of Judd Trump and O'Sullivan in order to dominate or be consistently world number 1. What do you think? Do you think I've analysed Steve fairly? Let me know.